What you're currently viewing is a video I made back in 2016, August 1st, 2016 to be exact. This was almost a whole 2 years after Source 2 was first publicly available in the form of an alpha version of the Dota 2 workshop tools, which apparently came out on August 6th, 2014. Of course, Dota 2 itself didn't have a Source 2 version till the year after that. Now, I'm not really that good at Dota, so I never played it that much, but after finally finishing this Gmod RP map in early May of 2016, the one you're seeing here, I immediately began looking into Source 2. I called this map RP Nahhelm originally, though I released it under a different name and soon after pulled it from the Gmod workshop due to various issues, mostly stemming from the use of episodic content. One of these days I'd like to re-release the map, but in my opinion, it isn't very good. That's not the topic of this video, though. The main point of this video is a discussion and some general advice or guidelines on the porting of Source Engine levels to Source 2. You can't just throw a Source Engine map into Source 2 like I did here and expect it to function properly. And though it might actually compile and run in-game, it's going to be a busted and laggy mess. Source and Source 2 are not that dissimilar with how the engine deals with level geometry. Contrary to popular belief, the Source engine is not actually brush-based. Even though you do use brushes to create levels, the engine itself, except for a few circumstances, completely ignores the brushes that were used when making the map. The BSP compiler turns those brushes into triangulated faces, which are what the engine actually renders. In Source 2, levels are designed the same way you would work in most 3D modeling software, by directly manipulating meshes via polygonal modeling. The concept of a brush pretty much only exists in the form of volumes for things like triggers or various non-visible functionality. So for the most part, you should get into the mindset that brushes no longer exist in Source 2. When porting a level over to Source 2, it helps if you practiced proper mapping techniques when designing your level in the Source engine. Proper technique can mean a lot of things, and I'm not going to make this video a discussion on when it's appropriate to miter your brushes, why you shouldn't always do it, or how shell/trough-based designs no longer work the same way. But in general, if you design things so that vertices are not just randomly against edges and you don't have faces existing outside of the map, you might be a lot better off depending on the method you choose to port your map. Besides level geometry, which I'll come back to later, the biggest issue with porting maps to Source 2 is porting the rest of the assets that are used in a map. These would be things like textures, models, textures for those models, and even sounds. Counter-Strike 2 comes with some tools that will help port maps, but there are a lot of downsides and limitations with these automated tools, and that will be the main focus of this video. If you want to learn more specifically about how to use these tools, go watch Top Hat Waffle's video he made just a week or so ago. If you don't know who Top Hat Waffle is, you need to go subscribe to him. He's an OG and his videos are a lot more beginner friendly than my long-winded philosophical discussions. I'm not going to rehash his video, but I'll explain the Source importing tools somewhat. CS2 comes with a little Python script that helps automate the conversion of your map, models, and textures into Source 2 using another piece of software, the Source 1 importer, which is also included in a few other Source 2 games like Sandbox. So yeah, you can use this to work with stuff that isn't Counter-Strike. This Python script was written in Python 2.7, which kinda tells me it might have been made a really long time ago, or that maybe Valve just decided to go with something extremely stable that isn't going to just randomly change during production, which is an extremely valid reason for sticking with 2.7. But if you plan on using this tool, I'd recommend downloading this version, which has been modified to work with the newer versions of Python and doesn't require you to mess with any weird path stuff, besides putting Python in your path, of course. One very important tip when using this script is to negate the final backslash in each path. The Python script automatically appends that final backslash, and if you have it there, the whole thing just breaks. Here's an example of the command I run with its arguments. Yes, you do need CSGO or whatever Source Engine game you're porting from installed, and the tool does extract assets from the game's VPK files and maybe GCF files. I don't know if it works with those. A big problem with the Source importer is that it doesn't know about existing assets that would already be appropriate for the level you're importing. In fact, even if the paths and names are identical to models or textures that already exist in Counter-Strike 2, this importer will still import the original source 1 versions of those models and textures. For example, here are 2 models that are included in CSGO. These also exist in Counter-Strike 2. This is a fresh add-on, so you can see they're read-only, which usually means it's an asset that comes with the game. Same goes for textures. Here's Wood, Vertigo, Ceiling, B, and here it is in Counter-Strike 2. These assets share the exact same paths and names in both games, so they should be drop-in replacements, but because the source import tools are not that smart, it isn't aware of the existing assets, so it just, understandably, imports everything brute force style. There is luckily a quick solution to this problem. Source 2's asset system is so insanely advanced and useful, you can use it to automatically find any assets in an add-on that overrides the default assets. Just open the asset browser, here where it says mods, select only your add-on, and then in tags, select only overridden assets. Now you have a nice list of all the things you imported that already exist in Counter-Strike 2. Just select all of these, maybe keep that sound events file, and just delete them. The asset browser will attempt to do some crazy dependency fixing thing, but you can just select no and OK, and everything should be good. Refresh your assets by reselecting the tag, and you should have no overriding assets anymore besides that sound events file. Back in Hammer, the models and textures are still there and have been updated to the new CS2 models. This is great and all, but it only stops you from using old versions of stuff that does exist in CS2. Counter-Strike Go has a lot of models and textures that are not included in CS2 at all, or not yet at least, since CS2 is hardly at feature parity with CSGO right now, so maybe more CSGO textures and models will be updated for CS2 in the future. For now though, there are tons of models and textures that just don't exist in Counter-Strike 2. These dumpsters or this shelf, for example. Same with textures. All of these textures are in CSGO, but not CS2. These are just a few examples, but a lot of these assets that haven't been ported to CS2 are things that most CSGO maps are likely using. The source importer will bring those in, of course, but it's kinda bad practice. Why? Well, let's just say you and almost everyone else who has ever made a CSGO map decides to port their map to CS2 using this source import system. So that means every single time you download a ported map off the workshop, you're going to be downloading another unique copy of the most commonly used CSGO models and textures that you probably already have somewhere on your computer because you already downloaded it from someone else's map, and so on and so on. Everyone who wants a quick and dirty map port is going to be bloating your hard drive up with copies of the same assets over and over and over again. I recommend replacing any CSGO models and textures that the importer script has brought over with newer assets that are already included in Counter-Strike 2. For textures, you can use the texture replacement tool. In face edit mode, shift right click to pull the texture into your active material, then right click and select replace textures. There are a couple of downsides with this. Sometimes the texture scaling will get messed up when replacing a lower resolution texture with a higher resolution one, and more importantly, there might not be an appropriate replacement texture in Counter-Strike 2 for your older texture. If that's the case, then maybe it will push you towards creating some new, custom textures instead of relying on the older CSGO assets. And if you already heavily rely on custom textures, maybe consider the benefits of manually bringing them into Source 2. Since you likely have the original masters of those textures, you can get better quality and better control over the properties of each texture by doing things manually. Though you can always edit textures that the importer tool brings in after the fact, so does it really matter? It's a similar story for models. Some models, like these dumpsters, which are really from Half-Life 2, have a totally appropriate replacement model in Counter-Strike 2, but it's a new model name or path. Source 2 does have an automated asset replacement system, but right now it seems like using it just crashes the tools, so you'll have to do it another way. Select your model, right-click and go to Selected Objects, and then click Select Similar Objects, or just press Ctrl-Alt-O. This will select every object with the same type and model inside your your currently active map. Now you can just open the object properties and replace the model with a new one. If the origin point is at a different height on the new model, you can use your arrow keys to nudge it a bit, but if the origin is different in other ways, you might need to go and individually fix the placement of the new models. If that's the case, I'd convert your selection into a selection set, which is like a source engine custom viz group, so that way you can quickly identify this group of models later on. Selecting similar objects only works if the model type is also the same as the model name. This one blue dumpster is a physics prop, but the rest are static props. If I select similar on the static props, you'll see the physics prop was not selected, so I'll manually select that one so I can replace them all at once. You can now use the asset browser to find and delete the old assets. Select an asset and choose Visualize References. If that asset is used in any map in your add-on, then that map name will appear in the chart, like this shelf model which I haven't replaced. The two dumpster models do not show any map name in their references, so they can be safely deleted. Moving on to level geometry, the import script can either directly import your level as it is in the VMF, or it has an option to build the BSP, and it will import the level with the triangulated geometry that the source engine would be using in the compiled map. And there's even a third way of getting your level into Source 2 that doesn't require any script at all. Just go to open a map, in the file type dropdown, select Source 1 map, and open your map. There's pros and cons to each method, which I'll now go over. If you're just directly opening a map up in Source 2 Hammer, the texture scaling on everything is going to be busted. So you're going to have to manually fix every single face, and that is just kind of unacceptable unless you just so happen to have used 0.25 or another common scaling factor for every single face in the entire map. Luckily, the import script doesn't have this problem. It somewhat maintains the proper scale factor, somewhat because as you can see, this texture is scaled at 0.125 in Source 2, but back in normal Hammer, it's scaled at 0.25. In reality though, in Source 2, it is actually scaled to 0.25. If you change the scaling to 0.25, you'll see no difference, but going back to 0.125, you will see the texture is much smaller. This seems like some kind of weird bug or behavior that shouldn't affect much, but you should be aware of it because it can cause confusion. Directly opening a VMF file in Source 2 Hammer will give you the level geometry exactly as it was in the original VMF. If you use the import script, it will be mostly the same, but it removes a few things. For example, any face that had the skybox texture will just be deleted. This can be confusing because the brushes that those faces belong to will still be there. I'd recommend replacing the skybox texture in your original map with either no draw or some kind of dev texture if you plan on using the import script. That way you'll be able to visualize where the old skybox brushes were. The same goes for area portals, hint, skip, and things like that. Just remove them entirely since they're not used in Source 2 at all. Both of these methods give you the original brushes, which if you want a functional Source 2 level, you're going to have to simplify into faces and meshes. This can be very time consuming, selecting each face of a map, inverting the selection, and deleting the unused faces for every single brush on the map. The benefit you get from this though is having everything in your map nice and clean, especially if you followed good mapping technique. Almost everything is going to be made up of perfect quads with matching vertices, so you'll be able to easily edit and modify the map. The third method is done by adding the usebsp argument to the importer script. This will compile the map and then import the geometry as it would be in the actual playable level, which as I mentioned earlier will be triangulated faces. The big benefit to doing this is that not only are there going to be no weird texture scale problems like the other two methods, but it also gets rid of any geometry that isn't part of the map, meaning you don't have to go and convert brushes to faces. Everything will be ready to go for the most part. The downside though is that everything is triangulated, which makes it a pain in the ass to work with, and the Source Engine BSP compiler doesn't do a perfect job at triangulation. Even if you made sure to follow proper mapping techniques, you're still gonna get disgusting results like this in certain places. Luckily, Source 2 doesn't really care if the meshes are triangulated in a bad way, so the map should work using this method, assuming you fix some of the other issues with lighting and things things like that, which I will once again refer you to Top Hat Waffle's video on the source import script to learn more about that. Really, the main downside to working with triangulated faces is that they are very difficult to edit. Say I want to add a little detail here. I have to find all the faces, combine them together with the backspace button, adjust the verts, and now I can add my detail, but I'll still have these weird edges from the adjacent geometry, so I'll have to go and clean that up too. And then I might as well fix everything else in this area. All that just to add that little detail. Smoothing groups, or edge normals as they're called in Source 2, might also be broken due to triangulation, and I'm sure a bunch of other stuff can get messed up that I just haven't found yet. But if you're just directly porting a map over, do you really need to add detail? Maybe not. So the BSP triangulation option might be the best option if that's what you're going for. An important thing to remember is that in Source 2, the entire viz system works differently. A lot of tool textures you might be familiar with no longer function the same way. No draw is used a lot less often, and the skybox texture might not work the same way you think it does. I cover the viz system a lot more in one of my older Source 2 videos, but I think I might remake those one day since the audio quality is kind of bad, yet they're still like my most viewed videos, so whatever. The next topic I need to cover in this video is scale. There are a few nerds who claim the Source engine uses 1 unit equals 1 inch, and they are wrong. I've covered exactly why this is the case in the past, but it's generally understood that the Source engine equates 1 unit to 3/4 of an inch for all level design and modeling purposes. On the other hand, Source 2's units are typically understood as 1 unit is 1 inch. So when you import a level into Source 2, technically everything is 1 1/3 times larger than it should be. A 16 unit wall was 1 real life foot in Source, but now in Source 2 those 16 units are 16 inches. However, because your character also is now taller, a whole 6 feet tall instead of the measly 4.5 foot tall Joe Rogan dwarf you were in the Source engine, everything will appear exactly the same size, at least in Counter-Strike 2, since everything is being scaled up proportionately. And you could even make the argument that CS2, a 2D only game that uses assets directly ported from CSGO, is still technically using the old measurement system, but VR supported games are a little bit different, since the perspective is based on your real life height. So you always want to try to scale things to real life measurements or they'll look too big. In a 2D game like Counter-Strike, does it really matter? Well, yes and no. For the most part, no, it doesn't matter at all. But if you're modeling something that has a known real-life scale, then it matters quite a bit more. Especially if you modeled things to real-life scale in Source using the 3/4 of an inch rule, those objects when ported to Source 2 are going to be much larger than another object that was modeled to the inch scale. So pick a scale and stick with it. If you are just porting a map directly from CSGO, then you can probably pretend that units still equal 3/4 of an inch if you want. The problems only arise when mixing scales. There is also the fact that, especially in a game like Counter-Strike, having things larger than they would actually be in real life is usually far better for gameplay purposes and is not really noticeable at all to the player. Some things don't need to be modeled to real life scale either, like oil drums. They're pretty close to their real life scale in CSGO, but because those models were ported directly to CS2, the dimensions are the same as they used to be, meaning they are technically bigger in the inch system. Does it matter though? No, because most people don't interact with oil barrels enough to be like, if I'm 6 foot tall, that barrel shouldn't be that high. Scale is something you need to know about and be aware of, but don't go crazy worrying about it. Just be glad the new system is equal to inches. Most modeling software should be able to export things as inches, so everything is going to be much easier moving forward. Now, throughout this whole video, I've been showing you just a test map, but I haven't really talked about what exactly happens when you import a real proper, working, finalized Source engine level into Source 2. So I've gone and I've imported one of my greatest maps into Source 2. This is a map that is perfect in Gmod. Everything is tuned so everything works perfectly. But in Source 2, check it out. It looks pretty good, right? Everything does look pretty cool. You know, even the skybox is there. But when you look a little bit closer, things kind of start to break down. Just to be able to show you this map, I've had to turn the render distance way down. I can't really show you the lighting. I guess I can turn it on. It destroys OBS. It just makes OBS not able to record. The thing with porting your map to Source 2 is that pretty much everything is going to be broken in some way. So really, it's almost pointless to port your levels to an extent. I'm sure if you were doing like a Counter-Strike level that really didn't have anything complex going on, it was just kind of like a layout. Like, I'm sure a much simpler map. This is like one of the most advanced Source Engine levels ever made. All of the cool things that make this map great, like the soundscapes, the perfectly tuned lighting everywhere, this custom texture of a candle flame I made, and animated textures just seem like they don't work in Source 2, or at least they don't get imported correctly. My seaweed texture, yeah, you just get a whole animated sprite sheet looking ass. These are also supposed to have tree sway. The little fishes, it seems like when it imported, it decided that the area around the fish is what isn't transparent, and the fish itself is transparent, so that's cool. If it's a finished level like this with 998 unique models, 2,164 unique assets, including materials, not including sounds, which the Source Import tool does not figure out. It doesn't know how to parse soundscapes, it doesn't know how to look at ambient generics or anything like that. So all your sounds, not in the game. Like, instead of taking your actual map, maybe take the idea of your map and make something new. There are just so many little things that are going to be broken whenever you port over a real, proper, full level. It seems like any texture that used Fong might not look good. I'm not sure. In Gmod, these should be metallic looking. Now, I don't know how it handles it. Maybe when you render it in the game, it will look good. And you're gonna have tons of stuff like this, these obsolete things. You know what these are? These are the ENV steam. These are those little particle effects that are, triggerable, and they're really useful. I use one over here too for the little oil diffuser. And even ropes, like just something as simple as a rope. It doesn't work the same way anymore, and it's going to be busted. So these ropes in here were custom textures that made it look like there was little fairy lights hanging around. I don't know if you can see, but on the edges of anything that was transparent, it seems like there's no padding. So what that tells me is either the Source Import tool just completely is incapable of dealing with transparent textures, or this is just a bug in the editor and it might look fine in game. I don't know. Let's say I wanted to compile just the potion area. It's going to have some issues because this importing tool, it imported kind of everything as a mesh, like a singular mesh. So even though I just want this area to be rendered, it's going to render out the entire map basically, including all of the geometry over here, because every mesh is all one. And everything's just a pain in the ass. Everything's broken. Like, even overlays probably aren't going to work. Like, this entire model is meant to be moving using custom texture functions that allow these gears to rotate, but it's not actually an animated model. It's a completely static model, and everything moves via Source Engine texture proxies. And if you use displacements with the texture that has like the special wrap texture parameter, so you can have nice looking textures on your displacements, well, that just doesn't work either. So everything's gonna look awful. And most people, they say that you should completely relight your level entirely. You should get rid of all the lights from Source Engine and completely redo everything from scratch, which, yeah, that's probably a good idea because you don't know how Source 2 is going to interpret the light values from the old lights. And it's like, does it really look better? Oh, the lighting's a little different. If you used linear or constant lighting to light your level, Source 2 is just going to completely misinterpret those values and you're going to get weird results. Source 2 looks pretty cool. Like, it's got this nice lighting and it looks kind of pretty. Wow. The power of Source 2. Cool. At least the textures look good. Those are some good looking textures. Whoa, look at that. That's crazy. It looks like Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. To wrap this video up, before you decide to port your map at all, you should first ask yourself, does my map really need to be ported to Source 2? This isn't just for Counter-Strike 2. I'm also talking about Sandbox and every other Source 2 game. Do you really need to see your custom edit of RP Downtown V5C Haunted Beta _D _D V2 in the new engine with slightly better lighting and the exact same models and textures? And I'm sure it will impress all of the idiots who post memes about the carve tool or how the source engine in Hammer is so old and outdated, all while never having actually made anything themselves. Maybe instead of porting your map directly, you remake it from the ground up. And even though Source 2 has been publicly accessible in some form for almost 10 years now, most people are now just getting into it. Who knows what the limitations of this new engine are, or what kind of amazing art people will create with it. And if you have any questions or, need advice about something Source 2 related, don't join some Discord server. Go post on a forum like the Mapcore forums or even Facepunch. That way other people that have the same questions you have will be able to find your question and get answers from it. Hopefully this video gave you some useful info about map porting. And if you made it this far into the video, click that dang old subscribe button, cause I'll be back next week with another crazy Blocktober video, I tell you what.